signed an agreement with an authoritarian state that persecutes religious minorities. This agreement guaranteed that appointed bishops do not criticize the regime and close their eyes to persecution of their Catholic brothers and sisters. This agreement was signed in 1933 with the Nazi Germany. We should not make the same mistakes and we should learn from the past. So proud to propose. What I'll do in this speech. First of all, I'll explain why I'll explain with my main argument why the Vatican has the ability to recognize the Roman Catholic Church in China, and my failure to do so makes it completely authoritarian persecution. Before I move on to these arguments, a few pieces of setup. What was the cause of neutrality for the last years? History is not kind to neutrality in the face of opposition. When the Vatican signed an agreement with the Nazi regime, it hoped to secure religious freedom. Instead, it lent authority to tyranny. We see the same mistake being repeated again today in China. Since 2018, the Vatican entered a secret agreement with the Chinese Communist Party. It handed the right to appoint bishops to government that surveils churches, jails priests, and replaces the crucifix with photos of their president Xi Jinping. That agreement has produced no real gains. Undevout Catholics remain persecuted. State churches preach loyalty to the party, not to God. And what has the Vatican done? We must understand the intentional weaponization of religion by the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping. Since early 2000s, and especially under Xi, the regime has launched a systematic policy called Sinicization, a campaign to transform all religions into tools of the state, strip the foreign influence, and align with the Communist ideology. What does this mean in practice? It means, for example, religious texts are rewritten to reflect party values. Images of Jesus are being replaced by portraits of Xi. Sermons are monitored, clergy are imprisoned if they resist, and so on and so forth. This communist regime also is the same regime that imprisons over 1 million Uyghur Muslims in re-education camps, bans Tibetan Buddhist practice, and persecutes Falun Gong followers to the point of forced organ harvest. Furthermore, the state church is not an independent religious institution. It is an extension of state repression. The device created in 1957 by Mao Zedong and by the party to fracture the Catholic Church and co-opt its spiritual influence. So when the Vatican recognizes the state church, it is not protecting faith. It is endorsing a lie, a fabricated church built to silence dissent and legitimize dictatorship. This debate asks, will the Holy See stand with the machinery of tyranny that rewrites the gospel and buries martyrs in silence, or with those who, like the Christians in the Rome, chose faith over fear, Christ over Caesar? So, moving on now to our first argument on how the Holy See has a moral duty to its followers. The first reason one, the Holy See has a duty to the Catholics as the one who inherits the will and legitimacy of Peter, founder of the Catholic Church. Therefore, being the only institution capable of granting legitimacy and validity to all the members of the clergy, with the Pope being the direct representative of God's will on earth. That means that the Catholics depend directly on the Holy See to be able to exercise their faith, a core of their identities. Someone can only be baptized, for example, if they have access to an ordinary member of the clergy, or the sacred rites holds no validity, and that the lost soul will never take martyrs, for example, that they can only, and all those who need the Vatican for all those reasons to be able to exercise their religion. Therefore, the false autonomy and capability of self-actualization, of fulfilling their metaphysical needs, of achieving salvation and avoiding eternal punishment in the afterlife is only possible if the Holy See, through its actions and representatives, recognizes and endorses their faith. That creates a strong moral obligation of the Holy See, since it's the only entity responsible and capable of enabling this moral autonomy to the Christians. Second reason, condoning and actively recognizing an oppressive regime such as the Chinese regime, even with the aim of minimizing its harms, is unjustifiable for two main reasons. A, to recognize it is to grant legitimacy to the regime and consequently to its actions. It is a symbolic act of empowerment and support for a bloodstained state. There is no way to separate its actions. Supporting one facet of the regime is supporting its success and consolidation, which means being complete with its nefarious goals. If you're supporting, if you make any kind of agreement, this means you're giving some kind of legitimacy and giving legitimacy to all its actions, not only to one party. Secondly, recognition also implies approval of the moral morality of the regime's actions and its underlying values. It is the establishment of certain tactics as officially accepted, such as tactics of freedom, such as attacks on freedom of expression by the government and attacks on freedom of religion, the destruction of human dignity through torture and pervasive imprisonment, authoritarianism, and disregard for individuality as valid means to uphold order. This means Holy See supporting and making agreements with the state-sanctioned church directly means they comply with actions of this government. They think this is okay because we want to protect our people, but by this saying it's okay to kill and persecute millions of Christians throughout this center. Before I move on, I'll take the POI. So recognize Taiwan and the expense of China, stating not pretend and more believe that the Holy See has directed to Christians. You can't compare this to any other religion or any other kind of population in the world, because Christians is the only religion that has this central state, that has this unity, such as Holy See, that has this duty to fight for them and to this duty to, with its followers, and to respect their past and to fight for their legacy. The third reason on this argument is the historical reparation. The obvious instinct when something is wrong is when something wrong is done is to try to restore the world to the state it was in before the harm occurred. This applies regardless of whether you were directly responsible. This means that this duty of reparation is especially compelling when it was your responsibility to prevent harm, in this case the Holy See. In this case, there is a duty long rejected by the Holy See towards faithful in the underground churches, a duty of recognition and fulfillment of its part in the reciprocal spiritual contract of the church with its followers. Therefore, for reparation to occur, it must be given in a form equivalent to the injury. The only adequate remedy for the Holy See to return things to how they should have been in the past is with the faithful of the underground churches being recognized and legitimized under its spiritual authority. Now, in this principle, how are these principles being harmed? Firstly, the Holy See is recognizing the very entity responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of its followers as the official representative of the church, granting this regime religious authority. Through the eyes of underground Catholics, the Holy See is not merely abandoning them through mission. It is actively endorsing their capture, torture, and killing. On our side of the house, the Holy See seizes its policy of turning a blind eye to the suffering of its believers, and instead recognizes their devotion to faith. It sends a symbolic message as God's representative to those who remain loyal at the cost of their own lives. They also remain loyal to the dogmas of Rome, refusing to yield to the distorted version of Catholicism propagated by the CCP. There is comfort and a sense of fulfillment for the faithful of the underground churches on our side, when they are finally recognized and legitimized by the Pope, the closest voice of God on earth. In all their acts of faith this honors and brings to light all those who were killed in the past, ensuring they are not forgotten. Under the opposition's model, words not being recognized, the underground faithful are necessarily framed as the illegitimate group acting against what is now declared to be the true representative to the church in China, the state-sanctioned churches. This is important for the debate, and more important than anything else, because for the faithful, their life on earth holds minimal importance compared to an eternity of fulfillment or suffering in the afterlife. The exercise of the Holy See's duties to enable them to live out their faith is more important than their very lives. It is thus preferable, even if the measure will result in greater. It's preferable the Holy See legitimize them, even if the measure will result in greater repression. For all these reasons, they're already explained. So proud to propose this one.
Of the underground church is nothing short of mere symbolic resistance. What lies underneath is the destruction of the followers' beliefs, their lives, their communities, their freedoms. So proud to stand alongside opposition today. Two arguments I'll be forwarding in my speech. Firstly, on why we prevent the extinction of the underground church, and secondly, why we moderate the Chinese patriotic church. But before that, I have two important clarifications to make on context. Firstly, recognizing the underground church would violate the ongoing 2018 China-Vatican Agreement, which was renewed last year to extend to 2028. This means that POP must defend a world in which you have an active and unilateral reversal of this diplomatic status quo by the Holy See, which would be a provocative statement. But secondly, the Catholic Church itself can be seen as increasingly Americanized. Pope Leo was elected as the first pope from US this May, and this decision was publicly praised by almost all American leaders, including Trump himself. So the timing of this shift is likely to be perceived as a Western-led challenge against the CCP's sovereignty and its control control, particularly since it would attract widespread attention on Western media. This perception would reinforce powerful anti-Western narratives within China, where citizens have been told since they were born that they faced a century of humiliation from foreign meddling. With that then, I would like to go into my first argument on why the recognition of the underground church leads to its extinction. Note that this cuts down an entire premise of that entire principal argument, because note that their principal argument was contingent on the practical case, that once you recognize the underground church, that they will be able to access this religious freedom, that they'll be able to reparate and restore the underground church to what it was before. But we'll be cutting this premise by proving to you that the underground church will be even more oppressed than before. With that then, what is the current treatment of the underground church? Unlike what Pop tells you, we think that currently, Beijing both factually and logically does tolerate a small underground Catholic church, and we will mechanize this to you. Firstly, because it has hidden operations. The majority of followers are socially isolated and operate completely underground, so underground members are careful to do very little to spread their message in fear of facing even the smallest of persecutions. But B, because the underground church is a shrinking threat. New believers tend to join the patriotic church because it has higher visibility, so the underground church is very, very limited in expansion. So we are not claiming that the underground church faces no persecution, but we do think that it is currently very limited. There is no reason for the CCP to surveil or attack a weak and powerless institution that is declining in power, and even less incentive to do so once their own church gets formal recognition. So the underground church will start losing followers on our side of the house as well. With that then, there are three reasons why this incentive actually flips on opposition side, and this is for three reasons. Firstly, because there's a loss of legitimacy of the patriotic church. The real threat to the CCP would be a powerful church whose existence undermines the CCP's authority and legitimacy, and Prop creates this threat for two reasons. A, because Beijing will be concerned that the underground church will grow in number, since their recognition signals to some Chinese Catholics that true religious authority lies outside of the state-sanctioned church. But B, because further, if the underground church gains traction, any shift towards anti-CCP messaging would pose a serious threat. Note, even if the underground church itself does not formally denounce the CCP, grassroots threats still remain. A single rogue bishop that feels empowered and morally righteous after gaining recognition from the Vatican could cite the Bible to implicitly or explicitly attack the CCP's actions, which would trigger a lot of dissent. Thus, the CCP would have to take further action to prevent the growth of a church that they simply cannot control in the future. The second reason then is that there is a sense of betrayal against the Holy See. When possible, Beijing would rather compromise because crackdowns do carry costs. However, now that this compromise has failed, they have to crack down. Look at their actions in Hong Kong after the 2019 mass protests. Before 2019, they were actually willing to offer Hong Kong concessions to pro-democracy advocates and to offer them voting rights. But after the 2019 protests, Beijing started cracking down because they saw their compromise as emboldening the opposition. Here, in this context of this motion, the CCP did compromise with the Vatican back in 2018. It allowed the underground church to discreetly practice their beliefs and allowed the Pope to veto their bishop selections. This wasn't an easy decision for Xi Jinping, who is a strongman leader and does not want to give authority to external actors. So on proposition side, at the point at which you actively recognize the underground church, that compromise is rewarded by the Vatican literally spitting in their faces. It will be seen as a group that cannot be trusted. Compromise is weakness. They will crack down, not believing that the Vatican will not go further to support the underground church. No, thank you. On to my third reason then, on why there's long-term reputational risk. Even beyond this specific case, the long-term implications of this retraction will trigger the CCP to respond. In cases like this, where the compromise has been undermined by the other side, we think that the CCP, not forcefully responding, actually sends a message to other parties that you can betray the CCP and actually get away with it. So this perceived weakness might invite more challenges against the CCP by other religious minorities within China. So this is a legitimate threat to the CCP's authority. With that then, let's be clear. What are the impacts of these crackdowns? Millions of underground Christians could face mass arrests, forced disappearances, or be forced to go into re-education camps, which are echoes of China's darkest chapters. It's currently not happening in the status quo. They can even be able to exert influence over the patriotic church's ideology and better moderate it. This is in 4 ways. Firstly, through direct leverage. The CCP will want to maintain people's support, fearing that without it, followers will grow skeptical of the CCP's church and choose their loyalty to God over their loyalty to the state. Further, it wants to achieve more common goals beyond just recognition, such as unifying both churches as agreed in the 2018 agreement. So the CCP needs the Vatican. On our side, there's trust and communication between those two actors to maintain this leverage. But secondly, through the bishop selection. Based on the 2018 agreement between the Vatican and the CCP, the Pope can veto bishop nominees that undermine Catholic beliefs. So this is a certain power on our side that will be cut once we take all of the actions from their side of the house. Thirdly, even without direct control of the nominations, cardinals do care about getting into the Pope's good graces because they've grown up being told that the Vatican is important and that and they want to climb up the hierarchy to become archbishops. The Pope thus has leverage over bishops directly, but only once they are recognized. Fourthly, we think that the patriotic church's dogma will change due to increased exposure to counterbalancing their mechanisms. We think that more bishops from the Vatican will visit China and that will proliferate to their followers that what they're being taught by the CCP is not necessarily true. On proposition, the CCP will be further incentivized to turn the patriotic church into a glorified center for the spread of propaganda. Vatican's direct challenge to the CCP authority means that even the slightest resemblance to the Vatican cannot be tolerated. So the CCP will strengthen censorship of Vatican narratives and surveillance over its own believers. We moderate the open church and Prop makes it worse. Oppose. Thank you.
opposition in this debate, they never acknowledge how the status quo actually looks like. They face the union as something magical, as something where China absolutely follows, that China will absolutely comply with the idea of unifying both churches, because of course, they obviously want the people who never go to church and are constantly fighting against joining the church, who prefer to die than to join the church to continue living. Now, the problem is that the status quo, China has already broken the agreement multiple times, appointing bishops without the approval of the Vatican, appointing bishops who never swore loyalty to the Vatican, to the Communist Party, bishops who only want to spread the interests of the Communist Party, not the interests of the Christian religion. A couple of things in my speech. First, some rebuttal and engagement, opposition's arguments. Secondly, where our principles are so important and relevant in this debate. And lastly, a second argument on how visibility is important for the underground churches. There are main questions in this debate with that. First, that recognition will see the distinction of the church. Secondly, that on their side can moderate the impact that CCP has on the church. Important to understand here that backlash is not only existing for the underground churches in this debate. Is that Xi Jinping has actual incentives not to continue persecuting or not to increase persecution in our state house, because that also leads to backlash from the Senate House. A couple reasons for this. First, because the CCP has no incentive to escalate oppression, because the Communist Party already navigating a domestic economic crisis with youth unemployment and real estate collapses, B, a rising international scrutiny over human rights, for example, the Uyghurs, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, and C, a trade war with the United States and growing tensions with the European Union. geopolitical context, escalating religious repression will be strategically self-defeating because it would, 1, trigger diplomatic backlash, 2, strengthen global criticism over China's authoritarianism, and 3, risk economic consequences like sanctions or consumer boycotts. This will level only Xi Jinping's own incentives not to do that inside of China. But notice how hot this also, secondly, generate an international backlash. Because notice how many Christians we have all around the world. Look at the United States, where Christianity is so strong, where the president is Christian, where the vice president is Christian. Look at Europe, where conservatism is rising with Christian movements, with Catholic movements. Notice how this is likely to generate a huge backlash for China because all of their main trade partners are part of the Catholic Church, and they're likely to retaliate because they also feel that their friends, their sisters, and their brothers are being. But notice also a consumer. People are also going to see this. It takes one camera with one bad photo of someone of Catholics suffering in China for people all around the world to notice the suffering, but they're putting people through. Why is this relevant? Because there are people who are willing to die for their faith. Because in China, people in the underground churches have been willing to die for their faith for a long time. We think all around the globe there are also a lot of very strong, very faithful Christians, and I think these people are also very likely to boycott China as what they can do. For example, a farmer in Brazil, because he's very, very faithful to his Christian, his Catholic faith, he's likely to stop maybe buying stuff from China, even if it costs more, because he understands that the cost is worth saving or boycotting his brothers, not complying to with the people who are actively harming his faith, who are actively harming people he identifies with, who are actively harming people. But even if not all of that is true, even if all that is false, even if you don't buy all this analysis, notice how the comparative then would not be worse on our side of the house. Because we think that persecution cannot get any worse on our side of the house. Because notice how the underground church on their side of the house is already subject to arrests, appearances, surveillance, torture, secret trials, propaganda, campaigns, and constant censorship on opposition's side of the house. This means that the baseline is already extremely high, and for China, there's very little room left to increase repression without it becoming extremely visible to the world, more than it already is, and generating more violence than it is. And once it is visible, the Vatican, backed by the vast global network, because notice how now, on our side, the Vatican is likely to have, the Vatican is actively supporting these people. They're exposing these images, testimonies, and interpretations of the views, which reunites public outreach and mobilizes Catholic and human rights groups globally. So the Holy See Commission would function as a moral megaphone and a diplomatic deterrent, not provocation. On the point of moderating the church, we think this is extremely simple as to why this is unlikely to happen. Because China has already violated the agreement multiple times. Because China will never see anything Vatican says. Because the main reason as why China continues persecuting the underground church is because they want to be the one with the most authority. This is why there are no Christian Baptist churches instead of pictures of Xi Jinping, because they do not want the Vatican to be more powerful. So we do not understand why they would ever comply with the Vatican agreement, as they do not do in the sense of, I don't understand why their house would be better. On our side, we bring you 3 principles. 1, that there is a duty to the faithful, because only the Vatican can enable the salvation of the Christians, of the Catholics. And these people who have fought for years and years and years to continue to be faithful to the Vatican deserve their recognition, deserve to know that there will be a space in heaven for them they die. Secondly, because there's publicity for recognition. Because a symbolic endorsement, anything that's symbolic already means a lot. It empowers the oppressive. It empowers China to say, Vatican's have the right, Vatican's have the right, other countries can't retaliate because the Holy See is giving them the moral compass. They have no response to how legitimizing the CCP Church also validates state control over the faith, also tells other people how to speak the right. And lastly, we can give you a principle of historical justice, because over the years, people have died over their faith in China. We think recognition restores the dignity of the martyrs. This is a duty that only the Holy See holds, and only in our side of the house is preserved. Pure.
Yeah.
China has things like concentration camps all over their country that international scrutiny has already found. The CCP has never responded to such scrutiny. Why would it work here?
Because we have Vatican help, we have Holy See recognition. Because it means that all around the world we have Christians and Catholics actively trying to backlash China because they see that the Vatican is helping. Because Vatican is the biggest compass, the biggest moral compass for all Catholics, for all Christians around the world. If Vatican and the Holy See themselves are recognizing the CCP, so that no one else around the world has the authority to question the CCP's story, because Vatican, at the highest level, is already giving CCP the authority, already legitimizing CCP. However, on our side, we have the Vatican saying that CCP is wrong, that they don't have the right to do that, they're legitimizing underground churches, because they have much more international support, because people will always stand, because Christians will always stand with that the Chinese government can oppress underground Catholics precisely because no one talks about them on their side of the house. The Vatican doesn't recognize them because they think that the CCP is right. But when the Holy See recognizes the underground church, it brings global attention. And with that, pressure, accountability, and actual protection that never exists on their side of the house. Because right now, the Vatican agreement with the Chinese state obscures reality because it gives the illusion that there's a religious freedom, that the state-sanctioned church represents Catholicism in China. This illusion is exactly what prevents journalism, human rights groups, and foreign governments from focusing on the actual persecution happening underground, happening in suburbs, where no one can see. When the Vatican instead publicly recognizes the underground church, that illusion breaks. It 1. Legitimizes the underground church as real, not illegal, not marginal to Catholic. 2. It empowers NGOs to track and defend the rights of its believers. 3. Forces international media to report abuses because they now invoke a recognized branch of global religion. And 4. It creates diplomatic consequences as Catholic majority nations face pressure from the citizens to respond to religious persecutions. The authoritarian states fear exposure more than moral condemnation because once their actions are known, their trade deals towards an international savings are at risk. For example, after the Nobel Prize was awarded to Liu Xiaobo, the Chinese government couldn't treat him like any other president because he became a symbol, because his name was spoken in parliaments and protests and in newspapers, because the visibility didn't save his life, but it changed the rules of the engagement. The same applies here. Proud of you.
I'm going to cover two classes, first on the principle and second on the practical for the underground church. But before that, I kind of want to clarify what the characterization of the CCPA is. Because from their first they seem to characterize the CCPA as this inherent moral bad that is always bad in all instances and all members of the CCPA are constantly under harm. Firstly, sure, the CCPA does spread some propaganda like the entire media and schooling system around it, but it also does protect the spiritual and emotional lives of entire communities. And that is much more unique of a role it plays. For example, for a mother in a rural city, she may work long hours and live under constant pressure, but will find solace in religion. But secondly, we argue that the church to some extent can be moderated, recruited through the continuation of existing mechanisms like involvement in bishop nominations, creating new leverage, and counterbalancing narratives that followers will be exposed to even independent of that leverage. Given that, even if we get on both sides, the CCPA will hold some power over its followers, it's better that we moderate them. Thirdly, we argue that moderation is actually more valuable because weakening the open church is not the same as making it better or less inclusive. Quite the contrast. When the CCPA feels under threat, its incentive is to hold its followers on a tighter leash. This means more indoctrination, this means more surveillance, this means more threat against dissent, this means more harsh punishment for dissenters. With that clarified, on the principle question, the general response to the principle, even if you don't take any of the smaller responses I'm about to give, is this. That on a level of logical priority, for any principle to matter to people, you need these people to be alive. Remember, panel, this is not an after motion. We must debate from a universal perspective. Universally, protecting life and liberty is much more important than symbolic gestures and religious purity. Subjectively, the Catholic Church may have prior obligations, but this is irrelevant to a universal standpoint. Responding to their first idea on the principle, then, as to how this is the only entity who can do things and allow for things like salvation, which creates a unique responsibility to the people of the underground church. At the top, obviously, this is contingent on our first argument on access to the underground church, but being charitable, 2 or 3 levels of response. 1. It is wrong that the Holy See recognition is the tipping point for salvation and all of the other benefits from manifesting in the first place. And the intuition problem is this. Many people are not in a situation to go to church. Many people, for example, are busy on their Sundays. Many people are in non-religious families that don't allow them to go to church. Many people live in situations where a church isn't readily available. these people still get access to salvation and all of the other benefits of Catholicism, regardless of access to church. And in the same manner, we would argue that the underground church still has some amount of access to salvation. But also secondly, we would argue that extending salvation to all people is not necessarily a responsibility that the Vatican has on a principal level. Because by this logic, then it would be principally wrong, for example, that for example, the Vatican doesn't create churches and rule Japan just because there are some Christians there. Maybe these people can't get access to salvation, but this then doesn't create a responsibility for the Vatican to have. But finally, they don't even fulfill their own responsibility, because recognition never connotes that there's proper and safe access to such institutions. So this is still practically contingent at worst. Responding to their second principle and condoning the harmful CCP ideas and tactics, obviously at the top, supporting the open church is not the same as supporting the CCP itself. Yes, it is an institution of the state and under some degree of state control, but by that logic, for example, supporting humanitarian aid in Gaza is analogous to supporting Hamas because it is facilitated through them. If our only way to help victims of the regime is through regime-controlled operation, that does not make it support of the regime. But also, there are a bunch of other responses we can give here. For example, should we even oppose should we oppose peace talks with Putin because he is evil, or with Hamas and Netanyahu, even if we could achieve a ceasefire and end a genocide? We cooperate with immoral actors to protect innocents all the time. It is insufficient for a prop to scream that the CCP is evil. They must then prove collaborating them with this is more evil than allowing underground Catholics to be tortured or killed. Secondly, the premise of this case is that the patriotic church remains evil after receiving recognition. The status quo has already produced results. Since 2018, 10 dioceses have received jointly approved bishops. Underground and patriotic clergy are cooperating in some areas. There are signs of gradual convergence and not collapse, which we improve further on our side. Walking away from this progress is not a principled stand, it is reckless abandonment. But finally, the Vatican is already an immoral actor. I genuinely don't understand what we got here. It is already complicit in immoral acts because it has institutionalized immoral acts. We constantly hear, for example, about child sexual abuse in the Vatican. It is the largest history of prosecution of gay people and religious minorities and women. Even if just supporting is what Pope cares about, the Pope shook hands with, for example, Duterte before the former Filipino president who massacred people. The Vatican is already immoral. Responding to finally the third principle on historical reparation then. For a reparation principle, they must prove active and intentional harm and equal reparational product. Not only did the Vatican not necessarily kill the people of the underground church, which doesn't create the necessity for a reparation principle, but we'd argue this is not even the way to give it back, because you aren't restoring any historical fact, you're recognizing the underground church, which creates harm to the people. Yeah.
So your whole case is built on the fact that the people from the sanctioned church are the most important stakeholders that should protect them, rather than the people from the underground church that had suffered throughout years and years from Chinese persecution.
Our first argument protects the people of the underground church. Before I do extension, because I don't want to run out of time, so here's the extending third argument. Maintaining the Holy See's unique diplomatic interests. The framing is simple. We are not just talking about the Catholic Church as a religious authority, but the Holy See, a sovereign state recognized by international law. Uniquely, unlike most states, it is not seen as a political threat or ideological enemy, but perceived as a neutral and principled moral actor. Vatican's moral diplomacy has historically been things about mediating ceasefires or securing protection or oppressed religious minorities, or influencing global opinion on issues like migration, poverty, and peace. This is a highly influential role, as Vatican statement leads to massive public opinion shifts in Catholic majority countries, shaping government decisions on things like aid or defunding war. Beyond politics, grassroots political Catholic communities can be driven to donate or support humanitarian causes as well. Prop shatters the diplomatic model that relies on persistent engagement to achieve slow but steady consensus globally. There are three reasons why. One, fractures the church. Pope Francis's efforts to deepen ties with China were initially considered controversial, but Catholics and the global community warmed up to the Pope's commitment to preventing polarization and fostering reconciliation. Prop's flip-flopping inconsistency undermines the church's unity and pastoral authorities for its followers. Secondly, it erodes the Vatican's reputation as a consistent diplomatic partner. As Hiroko explained, the sudden revoking of an existing deal will signal to other states that the Vatican is an unreliable and even worse, potentially politically charged actor. But thirdly, it confirms authoritarian fears that religious diplomacy is a trap. Authoritarian regimes' worst assumptions will be confirmed, and that repression is safer than cooperation if attempts at negotiation results in blowbacks. This is important for two reasons. One, the Holy See maintains formal diplomatic relations even with non-Western authoritarian powers, including China, Cuba, Iran, and parts of Africa. The 2018 CCP Vatican Deal gave the Vatican an entry into China's religious structure for the first time in 70 years since the Communist Revolution. Maintaining this trust and communication channel is the only way to allow the Catholic Church to influence and offer basic religious protections for its most vulnerable followers and authoritarian regimes. But also secondly, the Holy See is one of the most important global actors that engage in track-to diplomacy about diplomacy, about relationship building and changing perceptions for slow transitions to peace and unity. The Vatican's diplomatic trust is a rare and fragile asset. It doesn't use nuclear threats, but it opens doors no one else can. When you throw away that trust, you don't just lose China. You lose influence in every regime watching this debate. We protect that trust in that global world. Finally, because I have some time left, I want to defend our first argument against the two responses. The first response is CCP is under a lot of scrutiny, and etc., etc., etc. We pointed out this hasn't worked in the past. They say the tipping point is Vatican help. But obviously, the Vatican has historically called out, for example, humanitarian right crises in China before, and none of that has led to the international scrutiny necessary to undercut any of this. Furthermore, we argue that the CCP has already done and is willing to risk some backlash over risking their global power. Then they claim crackdowns are already bad. But the harsher Prop claims crackdowns already are, the harder it makes their own burden to prove that the Vatican can stop them on their side. At least in our group, we prevent them from making it worse. For these reasons, oppose.
Now, our pathway to victory was proving how the underground church is, of course, more vulnerable and how its followers are more vulnerable to the damages that the CCC might cause them, and also how the Vatican has a duty to protect its own followers that they impose this religion on. And we proved this, and that's why we win this debate. How I'll be structuring my speech. First, I'll be having three clashes, which is which side does the Vatican fulfill its duty, and then the second is which side supports more the CCC. And then third, which side actually protects all of these followers of the church. So first, I like to state that first going on to which side actually fulfills the duty of the Vatican. So first, the Vatican has a duty towards its followers, just like the state has with its citizens. We already stated this. Second of all, is that we have a sort of reparation that is a duty of the Vatican. And why is that? First, we already explained that an underground church kept loyal to Rome and kept loyal to the Pope and to the actual Catholic teachings for its entire existence, even during many, many decades of intense persecution where their side was being murdered and arrested by a dictatorial regime. And so we see that these people are actually devoted and are actually available to give up their lives in order to maintain their faith. And so, and also another thing is that Rome actually brought this religion and imposed that religion on them. So this is why we have this duty to protect these citizens of the Vatican States. And also recognizing the state church is basically betraying the devoted followers that kept loyal to the church for many years, and it's also betraying the Holy See itself. It's betraying their own teachings because they are supporting a church that doesn't actually follow any of their own teachings and is actually state-controlled and changes completely what they stand for. And also another thing is that by recognizing the underground church, we finally help out the vulnerable. And also, their case about diplomacy, even if this doesn't actually help with Holy See diplomacy, which we don't think actually is the case, it's still not as important as protecting its own citizens. Even if it doesn't actually help the diplomacy of the Holy See has their primordial duty of protecting their own followers and helping their own followers, and this is what's most important. And also diplomacy with the CCP, we already tried this. We already tried this agreement, and China broke this agreement multiple times. This diplomacy is a failure, and we already seen that we need to take action and not just this basic diplomacy. And so now moving on to which side actually supports the CCP. So first, we both agree that the CCP is bad and evil. Both sides have stated that they have internment camps. Both sides have stated that they have media control and other mediums of control that actually actively hurt the population and hurt them most. Those are the most vulnerable, which are the followers of the underground church. We already agreed that they are a bad stakeholder in this debate. But in their side, opposition supports a church that doesn't uphold the Catholic values and also validates the regime. The state-sanctioned church is basically an organ of the states. It's an organ of the state that the states, the CCP, can control and can influence the citizens. While on our side, we're protecting a church that actually uphold Catholic values and that actually uphold all these values that they want to uphold. They are protecting and they're validating an organ of the Chinese dictatorial party. And also, another thing is that they say that the CPCA so the state-sanctioned church is important. It's important for the people that follow it and how this is helpful. But we don't care. There are not the important stakeholders here. The people that follow the state-sanctioned church are not important in this debate because they don't rely on Rome, they don't rely on the Pope, and they rely solely on the state, and they're not actually important to this debate. We are talking about the ones who are actually vulnerable, because the people that follow the state-sanctioned church are not the ones that are being persecuted. The ones that are being persecuted are the ones in the underground church, and those are the ones that are actually important for the debate, and those are the ones that will actually be impacted by what happens in the debate. And also, they were saying that breaking this contract is wrong, but boo-hoo. China did it many, many times, and many clerical members were approved without the Pope actually approving it, and without the Pope actually helping with this decision. And so they have done it many times, and the Vatican has the duty to protect them. And also another thing is that this perceived weakness will make other parties react against the CCP. So by the Vatican showing some defiance against the CCP, this would make other parties react. But isn't this a good thing? Isn't this what would drive social change against the dictatorial and fascist party in China? We see that in our side, we can actually drive change instead of just validating what is going on in China. And also, before moving on, I'll be taking a while.
Yeah, you keep saying that the CCP keeps violating the 2018 agreement. They've never done this. Since 2018, all 10 people who were elected from the CCPA have been approved by the Holy See. Can you cite one example where this hasn't happened?
So we are actually appalled by this statements, because we have stated in our own cases throughout the bench what examples there are and what actually happened for this contract to even be broken. And we already stated how the CCP is, of course, will never help the underground church, and how they have no incentive to even help the underground church. And so the Vatican is the only stakeholder that can actually protect them. But also moving on to which side protects the church the most, the followers who control the church the most. So first, their argument is actually about the extinction of the underground church and how they're important and how this persecution on our side of the house would increase. But we already explained how this increase in persecution is highly unlikely, because first there's a lot of domestic there's also domestic and very much a lot of international instability right now. Xi Jinping does not want more of it, and many of China's trade partners are, of course, of Catholic descent, of Catholic culture, and just in general are of Christian culture. And we already explained that just one person filming and showcasing to the world what China is doing to these Christians and what is happening in China, giving this transparency, and the Holy See recognizing this church as the true church of China, this would mean that all Catholics in the world would be appalled and would be actually impacted. And so, for example, trade wars, sanctions could actually hurt China. And even the people that are trading with Chinese companies, even the farmer in Brazil wouldn't sell the soybeans that they farm to Chinese companies because they don't want to reconciliate with a country that is hurting their own members of the same church. People have empathy towards people of the same faith, and this is a fact. And this is why we also know that backlash is highly unlikely. And so in persecution, we see that we don't have this persecution. And second, we have transparency, as we already explained. The Holy See's recognition is crucial for protection because they hold China accountable, and it protects much more than their side. And so a little bit of weight here. So with their best case scenario, we still have more religious freedom on our side. We still have less persecution on our side. And we win on the pragmatic, but we also win with the principle of Vatican fulfilling its duty, which they don't actually engage in. That's why I'm so proud to propose it.
Yup. Is this volume playing? Is this volume playing? Can you hear this volume? Yeah. Third opposition speaker says, Holy See needs to protect its followers, that they should do this above anything else. That Rome imposed the religion on the underground church, so Catholics is the most prioritized, the actor that we have is prioritized. But we were clear here from the first speaker that this specific action that the proposition takes on their world is what creates the harms and it magnifies it on their side of the house. If you are able to prove to you where the harms get worse, we are able to fulfill the duty that we have proved to you. The second thing I want to point out is that their principle and how there shouldn't be complicit in evil was completely contingent on the characterization of CCPA being bad. We proved to you through three mechanisms in our second speaker as to why CCPA can be good, sufficiently dealing with the premise of their case, lack of response from their proposition is that encouraging strategy. I want to talk about two things. First, on the principle of duty. Second, on the livelihoods of those in underground church. Lastly, on the global impact, explaining why the uniqueness of the is important. No, thank you. First things first, let's talk about the principle. I want to note in strategy that the proposition's principle must have been inherent to the recognition of the underground church. Because if the conclusion of their principle is that we should care, we just literally care through our practical argument. I want to do two things under this though. Firstly, I want to bring back the CG's call out that this duty is irrelevant. Secondly, that this duty doesn't exist. Firstly, that this duty's relevancy. Because I want to point out that this motion is not an actor motion to begin with. It is a third-party motion to begin with from a neutral perspective. And therefore, there is no moral distinction between a duty that this Vatican has and this duty to protect other individuals about the livelihoods of the individuals on the ground. It's unclear to me why the subjective duty that they have pointed out is important to begin with. But secondly, in terms of why it doesn't exist, they have multitude of principles. Let's engage in one by one. The first thing they say is that recognition is necessary for salvation. Why? This is a literal assertion. There are hundreds of thousands of underground churches on the ground. And I want to first point out that I think a lot of the popes do tell them what the God thinks, and individuals, in fact, individualistically connect with God. Unclear to me why recognition is that important. Secondly, in terms of historical reparation, I want to point out that this is entirely practically contingent. Thirdly, in terms of emotional solace, one, we are proud to value human lives over human feelings. This case simply isn't just impactful on the debate. Two, emotional solace is contingent on underground Catholics being able to access their religion, which they say they cannot in their world. Three, this is symmetric to the emotional solace that open church followers get in our side of the house. Because notably, there is no moral distinction between those individuals in underground church and those individuals in the CCPA. On their world, CCPA lose the recognition, which is the reason why I think they lose on this as well. The final thing I think is that you'll be complicit in evil church. Even if you don't buy these three mechanisms we provided you in your second speaker, I want to point out, one, there's a difference in supporting CCP and CCP. But two, this is contingent on CCPA being inherently bad. We provided you our second argument as to how you can literally improve the CCPA through the leverage that they say exists. The reason why the leverage is unique in our world was literal three mechanisms that is still unresponded to. That the Holy See's recognition as for legitimacy, that it decreases the resource burden for the CCP, that there's a diplomatic benefit, and the CCP just gains the benefit uniquely in our world because the Vatican now supports CCP uniquely in our side of the world. The final thing they say is that China has broken agreement. No, literally since 2015, the 10 appointed ones were from the Rome, not from the CCP, which is why you're just blind in this debate. Finally, before the practical clash point on.
Why is the benefit of the government-sanctioned church exclusive to your side of the house? Why don't we have this also in our side of the house? Why wouldn't this happen?
I don't get what benefit they're talking about, but if you want to talk about crackdowns, let's chat about it right now. I want to note, don't underestimate the impact we prove to you, because we prove in our world that when they're set up in house, churches will be desegregated and that followers will be detained. If they cannot safely access their church or have no churches at all, then they cannot practice this religion, which is prerequisite for their principles of function. But on terms of their, you're just taking risks all the time, I want to weigh their principle below this practical clash for two reasons. Firstly, because we prove the extent of persecution they face now is much smaller than the type of persecution that exists in their world. Insofar, the capacity for the CCP to crack down exists symmetrically on both sides of the house. The difference on both sides is the incentive. We explain when incentive magnifies in their world. Secondly, because the majority of them didn't even meaningfully consent to this risk. Children following their parents to church, wives following their husbands, all of the things are the risks that they never consented to. I think they're intuition pump and not a the principle being important doesn't stand. Two sub-themes under this clash. First, on the clarification of the status quo website. Secondly, on whether backlash works. Firstly, on status quo. Because Proposition wants to tell you that the status quo is already bad and people are taking risks. I've pointed out that this is just not true. But even if this is true, this is strategically bad for Proposition. First, because the harsher Proposition claims crackdowns already are, the harder it makes their own burden to prove that the Vatican can stop them on their world. Secondly, even if crackdowns are as egregious as they say, this is not comparative. And one thing that they need to say is true is the fact that the underground church already exists in the status quo, and the CCP has allowed it to exist. What we have claimed to you is that on their world, CCP will literally crack down and just make it extinct. Now then, let's chat about why crackdowns will happen more on their side. There were two main challenges. The first claim they make is that the Vatican can now use its leverage to protect its underground followers, independent of things like attention. The first thing I want to point out is that whatever leverage Vatican has, it is lost after they lose trust of the CCP by recognizing the underground church, and once the CCP has nothing left to lose. In order to try and appease the Vatican, the CCP needs to believe that it is a trustworthy partner that they can rely on and allow them the authority to run the CCP to begin with. Once it is recognized an underground church, it is impossible for them to, not already have the uncondemned and open church, because they would have to say in the underground church is only legitimacy, and therefore all of which means to you that the CCP would not listen to the Vatican on their side of the house. The leverage that they say is important only works for our side of the house. Finally, let's talk about their claim of backlash. Note, if this was possible, then they would presumably also listen to the demands towards workers in the first place. But the second thing I want to point out is that things like countries sanctioning them presumably is unlikely to happen, because people and the countries are presumably reliant on the Chinese imports. I think China is the #1 exporter in the world. But let's say their best case happens, that you get attention and there's going to be some benefits that towards it. The first thing I want to point out is that literally no one cares, right? Currently, we all know that the workers are suffering, but we obviously prioritize our self-interest over others, because it doesn't directly impact you. But secondly, this is short term. There's so much information in status quo, it's unclear to me why this one single information will help you. Third of all, there's a time lag problem, right? There's a time in which this attention materializes into support. I think what CCP's response does is to crack down now before the help comes in. But the final thing I want to point out, independent of any other clash in the debate, is our third argument that still hasn't been responded to. Because what we proved to you is the unique diplomatic influence that Holy See has outside of China, in countries like Cuba, in countries like Iran, where Western countries have failed to actually provide support for the most vulnerable individuals on the ground. I think we create the largest impact in the debate through our third argument. We are able to provide unique help through the leverage that the Holy See has. The lack of response from the third proposition was damning for their case. On the scale of impact, we went on this important clash.
In China, recognition is not a moral gesture, it is a risk. To endorse the underground church is to invite repression, not revival. It sacrifices believers for symbolism. In opposition, we protect people in ways that actually matter. At the top, an independent path to victory. Unresponded is our third argument that proves that the maintenance of the Holy See's unique diplomatic influence not only impacts people in China, but globally. This was a fairly important argument. The impact of this argument proved that in every regime, authoritarian or not, that the Vatican's unique standing as they concede in the global diplomacy sphere allows for the Vatican to influence countries in ways that no other nation can, that its standing in international law as a sovereign state with neutrality and with moral mindset in mind allows for its power to be heard around the world. The weighing for this argument was simple. One, on the level of scale, the number of people and the situations that these people are in, and therefore, by extension, the way by which we save these people extends beyond China into every authoritarian state in the world. On the number of people, but also the intensity of impact that we save them from, this is an important argument. Secondly, in the worst case, even if this is speculative in terms of saving vulnerable people, both sides have vulnerable people that the Holy See can potentially save, but cannot 100% certainly save. So at least this shouldn't be a reason to vote in favor of the proposition. But finally, on the level of certainty, because just the fact that you change the decision, you change and alter the decision to go against the previous Pope Francis' decision, and the norm from the last decade fractures the church, regardless of whether consequences of this decision is good or bad for China. So this is true on the level of certainty. We would argue this independently wins us this debate. not just because they didn't engage to it, but also because this was an important impact, a certain impact, and one that proposition had to deal with. Their lack of response alone is damning. This is the most important thing I wanted to do in this speech. The second most important thing I wanted to do in this speech is to weigh off the principle in this debate. From deputy, we do the majority of the work, and my whip extends this work. We proved that all of these principles are practically contingent. This is true on 3 levels. On a very intuitive level, access to the church is the prerequisite for all of their principles manifesting. Reparation doesn't matter if you can't accrue any of the benefits of reparation. Protected access to salvation doesn't matter if you cannot access the church that offers that salvation in the first place. So we would argue that we win on the level of practical, obviously due to the lack of response, and this wins us on the level of principle. But also secondly, their principle is just flawed in a lot of ways. For example, their argument that we all protect the access to salvation never makes it clear why the recognition from the Vatican is the only unique way by which an individual can access salvation. We responded in 3 levels to their second level on the principle on condoning the CCP, and we proved that none of the criteria for reparation is ever met under their principle line. So, on the practical level then, which we've proven is more important. Firstly, on the underground church. Their incentive responses boil down to, well, we can get international scrutiny. But if this were true, the underground church would have been saved already. The reason why it hasn't worked is because international scrutiny fails. And the mechanism and the tipping point that they would prove is Vatican says it, so it must be suddenly extremely influential. But the Vatican says a lot of things that never actually happen, including against China. For example, the Vatican calling out the concentration camps in rural China has never manifested in these concentration camps being reversed. So the methodology of international scrutiny doesn't work. The only way is to decrease aggression, which we do through recognition of the CCPA. Finally, on the CCPA, they claim that the benefits of the CCPA are not mutually exclusive and can be accessed in their world. The problem with this one-line response is not only from the intro from my deputy did we prove that it actually gets worse in their world, but they are the ones themselves who say the CCPA is bad, and we provide the CCK with a unique methodology to rectify its harmful practices. Because Vatican recognition is the only methodology by which moderation of the patriotic church can ever be achieved. No other diplomatic method has worked. We must recognize the CCPA, both for the underground church, for the CCPA, and for every other country in the world. Opposed.
Sounds ready to call the time. Because in 2022, the Chinese government unilaterally moved Bishop John Feng to a diocese not approved by Rome. And this violated the agreement because it wasn't approved by the diocese. However, Farrington really issued a note of regret. No sanctions, no consequences, just silence. And that moment exposes the reality and opposite of the house. That the Vatican is not an equal partner to China. That a symbolic stamp that is used to legitimize its control. So I'm very proud to propose. Couple of my speech. First, I'll go on what this debate is about. Then, on our principle is so important. Secondly, on pragmatism. First, why is principle so important? Because this debate is not only about pragmatism. Because religion is not really about pragmatism. Because Christianity is not really about pragmatism. It's about moral legitimacy, spiritual truth, and institutional responsibility. Things that are only fulfilled, burdens that are only fulfilled by the Holy See on our side of the house. People, vulnerable people, who are only protected on our side of the house. What are the principles we bring to that? One, that there's a moral duty for the faithful, for the ones, the Holy See owes spiritual loyalty to those who have fought tirelessly to profess the true doctrine. Secondly, that there's an obligation that enables salvation, because the Holy See is the only body that can grant the doctrinal legitimacy to the clergy, and thereby enable the sacraments necessary for the eternal salvation that all Catholics fight for. And lastly, because there's also a historical preparation that is needed that is never granted in opposition to the House, because there's decades of abandonment that demand symbolic corruption, a measure that the opposition never does. It's equivalent of. Why is this so important? Because Catholicism is also highly symbolic. Because lost family members, people have lost family members for their faith. They're willing to die for their faith. And this just shows how much their faith means to them. Validation is crucial, because the Holy See recognition shows support for everything they have ever fought for, because it validates their efforts and tells them that they're not evil. Because guaranteeing legitimacy to the clergy means that someone, because the clergy has no legitimacy from the Holy See, it means that someone cannot be baptized by the now underground churches, because then they don't have access to an ordained member, which means that the sacramental rites hold no validity in their separate house. Because Catholics depend on the Holy See to be able to exercise their faith, which is a core part of their identity. Because the only way Catholics can achieve true salvation is through the recognition. Because it is fundamentally wrong to actively recognize and change and grant symbolic empowerment to someone who tortures, who persecutes, and who kills those who are only trying to portray their. We think your principles are clear to our things. We think one, it is constitutionally correct and morally correct for the Holy See to do this. We think it is their duty to protect those who constantly fight, continues and who have continued to fight. And we think secondly, simple recognition is already enough for these people, with everything they've ever fought for. Their faith should be validated only under their house. But secondly, on the prayer plan, because they have this same ability that they do win on us. They tell us two things. One, on backlash, and secondly, on cooperation. Cooperation is very easily mitigated, just by the example I tell. The CCP will never cooperate with the Vatican. Because for an authoritarian regime, cooperation means surrender. Because authoritarian regimes always want to be the ones more powerful. Look at the example, they already betrayed the agreement once. They already betrayed the agreement multiple times, which is one of the main multiple examples. We think it is likely that this happening again. We see no incentives for the CCP to join, combine the underground church with their church, but they are actively torturing people from the underground church. And then on that, we tell you that one, it's unlikely to happen because it increases domestic instability. Secondly, there's international backlash. And lastly, that the persecution could never get so bad on our side of the house, or else the backlash will only be increased. And they try to have this push, we're going to increase more credibility for their side. But notice how the Vatican on their side is not neutral. They're actively supporting the Christians. And this is only decreasing more credibility on this house, because it's telling other authoritarian regimes that they can also persecute people who are very faithful that on their side, the Vatican is not going to do anything. So their backlash to their side. So we tell them that visibility is crucial. We tell them that it legitimizes the underground church, that it empowers NGOs, that it forces international media, and creates diplomatic consequences. We tell you that this is a layer of protection that's kind of full, never tried. We tell you that our only side of faithful are protected. Proud.